So up to this point, we've talked about evolution by natural selection. We've had a kind of a historical framework of the development of Darwin's theories. And remember, of course, that for evolution to occur, there has to first be variation in that trait. Secondly, that variation has to be heritable. And then thirdly, that heritable variation has to be associated with differential survival and or differential reproduction. So now we will take a look at some of the evidence that Darwin used himself and that we can still use to support his theoretical framework. Darwin presented evidence with respect to artificial selection, the geographical distribution of species and traits, the fossil evidence that was available, comparative anatomy, comparative embryology, and the existence of vestigial organs. So we will talk about each of these in turn. With respect to artificial selection, I mean, at this point in human history, there had already been big enough differences bred into quote unquote breeds that if we'd found those differences in nature, we would have given different species designation. So, for example, when we look at dog breeds, dogs are one of the oldest domesticated species. Their date of domestication goes back 30 40,000 years. And in this history of domestication, we've ended up with breeds that range in size from Chihuahuas or even some of these teacup, like poodles and such, to Great Danes. So if we were to come across wild canids in the same habitat, where some were teacup poodle size or Chihuahua sized and some were Great Dane size, we would assume that we had more than one species present. All breeds of dogs are the same species. They are all Canis familiaris. They can interbreed, but you better hope if you're interbreeding Chihuahuas and Great Danes that it's a male Chihuahua with a female Great Dane, because the converse would be very dangerous in terms of the health and well-being of the mother Chihuahua if she were to bear puppies that were sired by a Great Dane. We've seen similar kind of artificial selection with domesticated plants. So we've got here a picture of teosinte, which is the wild grass from which corn was developed. Teosinte in its natural form throughout Central and South America it has roughly 5 kernels on each seed pod and only a few seed pods per plant. In this history of artificial selection, we have selected for much larger ears of corn with many, many, many more kernels on them. We have selected for multiple ears of corn per stalk, taller stalks with with a greater yield. And this was really the deciding factor in the emergence of state-level socio-political systems in the New World. That until we developed a carbohydrate staple that could feed an increasing population density, and that New World carbohydrate staple is corn, we don't see states emerge. And so if you look at the emergence of states in the New World, you find that there's first of all, a lag time relative to the Old World, but that particularly in North America, we don't see the emergence of state-level sociopolitical systems until corn makes it across Central America and into North America. So there's an incredible lag time, an incredible delay in sociopolitical complexity because we lack that domesticable carbohydrate staple. Darwin used the geographical distribution. We've talked about his finches, for example. And he noted, first of all, that different kinds of animals are more likely to be present on islands than the mainland, but he also noticed that when there was competition on islands, animals changed in character. And so this is the finch beak that we've already discussed, that on small islands where there's no species competition, we see an intermediate beak shape. As we get greater levels of competition, as the islands increase in size, we see more and more specialization. So on medium islands, you might have 2 populations with 2 distinct beak shapes or sizes. And when you get 3 species, you're going to see an even greater degree of specialization with 3 different sized beaks. And so using the Galapagos Islands and this distribution of finch beaks to support this claim. Darwin used fossil evidence. Now, Darwin didn't have Australopithecus africanus to look at, right? But there were discoveries of fossils already in this period in the 1800s. And we are going to look at Australopithecines as an example of kind of the path through which evolution progresses. And so we have here two different parts of the body between chimpanzees, Australopiths, and Homo sapiens, the pelvis and the foot. Both of these are very closely related to the development of bipedality, or two-legged upright locomotion. So modern day chimpanzees have a pelvis that's a lot longer than it is wide, and doesn't flare as much as the sides of the human pelvis do. Modern humans have a pelvis that's wider than it is long and does have this flaring shape to it. The pelvis is one part of the body that enables us to determine the degree to which bipedality was practiced. And in bipedal organisms, this pelvis starts to change shape. And so if we look at the pelvis of Australopithecus africanus, one of the gracile Australopiths, we see that it's intermediate between that of the chimpanzee and the Homo sapiens. Now, we don't have one quote-unquote missing link. That another criticism of modern evolutionary theory is or another thing that's brought up with respect to why evolution can't be true, is that we don't have a missing link. We haven't found the missing link. Well, for fossil hominins, we've really found as many as like 12 missing links, really exhibiting this kind of mosaic process of natural selection. And so the pelvis of Australopithecus africanus is very much adapted to bipedal locomotion and reflects those constraints. We can look at the foot as well and see a similar story presented in the foot, that chimpanzees still retain an opposable big toe that aids in their climbing ability. Australopithecus africanus has toes that are in line with one another, but we don't yet see the arch of the foot by the time we've got really even Homo erectus. But of course, certainly with modern humans, we see not only the toes that are in line with one another, but we see this commitment in the foot arch. So, what's the story with respect to the big toe and the arch in the foot? Well, ancestral hominins, particularly the Australopiths, had to rely on tree climbing when they were being pursued by predators or even nesting at night. By the time Homo erectus is on the scene, we no longer need to climb trees because we have both advances in tool technology that enable us to use those same tools for protection, but we also have the advent and intentional control and use of fire. And so with Australopithecus africanus, we have the big toe that is well suited to bipedal locomotion during the day, but we don't commit to the arch, which lowers our ability to climb trees. By the time Homo erectus and then Homo sapiens emerge on the scene, we've got cultural means by which we can avoid predation, and we don't need that safety of climbing trees, and so we commit to the arch in the foot as well. Interestingly enough, there's one population on the planet that has a bit of a genetic anomaly present, and that is native Melanesians, so like the islands of Papua New Guinea and such. They've got DNA that's not shared by any other group of living hominin, or really, shared by all other humans on the planet, basically, that may harken back to ancestral DNA. And I've got a good friend who's from Papua New Guinea, and both her and her daughters are exceptional tree climbers, to a degree that my kids could never compete. And she's also one of the only people I know that had enough room in her mouth to house her wisdom teeth, so she never had to have her wisdom teeth extracted. When we compare across taxa, we find that the same bones are present in the forelimb of the mole, the arm of a primate, the foreleg of a horse, the wing of a bird, the wing of a bat, and the front flipper of a seal. Why would we share the same bones in very different kinds of morphologies and for very different functional purposes unless we were derived from common ancestors? And the same is true of comparative embryology. If we look at the earliest embryonic stages, the totipotent kind of 4 to 16 cell embryos, you wouldn't know from looking at a 4-cell embryo what species embryo it was. Similarly, at early stages of development before we see specialization of organ systems and such, these species are indistinguishable. So if you look across one here, you can't tell the difference between a fish, a salamander, a tortoise, a chick, a hog, a cat, a rabbit, or a human. They all look similar. You see the development of the backbone, yes, because all of those species just mentioned are vertebrates, but that's about it. By later stages of development, you can see the difference between, let's say, quadrupedal organisms, those that live on land and those that swim in water. And even later stages of development, you see specializations along mammals versus birds and reptiles, so on and so forth. So as development proceeds, we see more differentiation, but in these early embryonic stages, we can't distinguish between different taxa. Darwin hypothesized in the 1800s that one day we would find fossil whales that still had functional pelvises, and he wasn't proved right until 1996. And so I don't remember how many years ago it was. In the same year, we had traveled both to Washington, D.C. and to Chicago. And so we had toured. My kids love to go through natural history museums. I mean, that's what they get from having a biology geek as a mom who then went on to study anthropology. And so museums and zoos are the two things that we most often do when we travel. And one of those two natural history museums had a wonderful display on the evolution of whales, where it had every step in the process, and it showed the hippo-like herbivores that were land-dwelling that whales evolved from, and showed these stages of development where they were spending a lot more time in the water, but yet still retained arms and legs, to the point that they got rid of their hind legs and their front arms became these front flippers. And this exhibit was just amazing in what it showed. I also have a colleague whose husband happens to study whale evolution and came out with some papers within the past 5 years that looked at how the pelvis now functions in whales. And so whales still have pelvic bones, but those bones have migrated. And so since they were freed up from being needed for locomotion, they've been co-opted into a really interesting role. And so since whales are no longer quadrupedal and really even bipedal, they're simply not land-dwelling, they're not walking, they're swimming, that pelvis has migrated and now serves as an anchor point for the muscles that control whale penises. And so whales, dolphins, porpoises, orcas, all of those are capable of what he called acrobatic feats of penile dexterity, and that they have a lot of control and can make their penis move in very interesting ways. And so the only way that was able to develop was because the pelvic bones were no longer needed for locomotion and were able to be co-opted for another feature. Humans have vestigial organs too, and so we often hear that the appendix is vestigial. That's not entirely true. You can survive without your appendix, but particularly if you eat a strictly vegetarian diet, the appendix still has some function. But two better examples of vestigial organs among humans are the coccyx, or our tailbone, and our wisdom teeth. The coccyx, we lost our tails more than 20 million years ago as apes were evolving. So we still possess a coccyx, and it's incredibly painful if we happen to break it, but it serves no function whatsoever. Similarly, wisdom teeth were needed before the advent of cooking, when we relied on our strong dentition and strong chewing muscles to be able to process our foods. Our molars would wear down by the time we were 18 or 19, and we'd need that third set of molars to come in so that we could live into adulthood and be able to process the food that we ate. We now see upwards of about 30% of the population that doesn't even have wisdom teeth. So it's not simply a matter of, oh, they got their wisdom teeth removed. We are seeing a greater proportion of the population that doesn't possess wisdom teeth. Those wisdom teeth never formed. And so we may, in a couple generations' time, see the loss of wisdom teeth as a trait at all. And certainly, most of us, if we have wisdom teeth, we have to go through painful tooth extraction or surgery to get our wisdom teeth removed. And so just think about how much of a benefit those of our peers who don't have wisdom teeth have over us in not having to undergo this mouth surgery. All right, so I also want to point out the difference between the two major kinds of evolution. So we can call this macro and micro evolution, or we can call this phyletic evolution and speciation. Phyletic evolution or microevolution refers to changes in the phenotype of a population over time, within a species over time. This is simply species changing in character. And we'll talk about one specific example that happened during the Industrial Revolution with the peppered moth. You may remember this from high school biology, but there's an abundance of evidence that evolution of this sort occurs, that we see phyletic evolution. Most of the evolution that takes place is of this sort. By contrast, speciation events have a pretty big impact. This is the divergence of one species into two or more species. They are much less common in the fossil record, but there are times over our geological history of the Earth that we have had rapid speciation events. So following mass extinctions, for example, we see rapid periods of speciation. So like when the asteroid hit and the climate change and dinosaurs went extinct, we saw the adaptive radiation of many, many types of mammal species. So this is a demonstration of what we mean by these speciation events. And so here we have our example with the peppered moth. Both before and after the Industrial Revolution, there were two variants of the peppered moth. There was the peppered or speckled variant, and there was the melanistic variant. The peppered or speckled variant is a kind of gray, white, and black mottled moth. The melanistic variant is more of a uniform black in color. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, trees had lichens growing on them, and so trees looked gray and speckled, grayish green. Lichens are a symbiotic relationship between fungi and mosses, and really are a living entity unto themselves, but changed how the surface of trees appeared. So over here on the right, we have a tree that's covered with lichens. The mechanism of natural selection is bird predation. And so really we're looking at whether the birds which variant of the moth the birds could see if they were circling overhead. And so on a tree that's covered with lichen, we have pictured here the peppered variant that is circled in red, and the melanistic variant, which is not circled. If you were a bird circling above, which of these would you be able to detect? That's right, you would see the melanistic variant, and you would preferentially then eat the melanistic variant, not because it tastes any different, but simply because you can see it. And so at this point in history, there would have been many more peppered phenotypes present in the peppered moth genome or the peppered moth population than there would have been melanistic phenotypes. After Industrial Revolution, because of coal-burning plants and wood-fired plants, we have the deposition of soot on the surface of many trees that changes the trees to basically black. So again, on this black trunk, we have the peppered variant, which is not circled, and the melanistic variant, which is circled. Again, you're a bird soaring overhead. Which of these are you going to eat? That's right, you're going to eat the peppered variant because you can see it. So very quickly, within just one generation, we have an abrupt shift where 60% or more of the population is now melanistic instead of speckled because of bird predation. We see a good example of speciation in the New World with shrimp. Prior to about 3 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama was still underwater, and we had one population of shrimp that lived on both the Pacific and the Atlantic side of what eventually becomes the Isthmus of Panama. At about 3 million years ago, the water levels change and the Isthmus of Panama emerges. This divides then the Atlantic and Pacific sides. And we see rapid divergence into about 6 different species of shrimp. 3 on the Atlantic side, 3 on the Pacific side. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at these shrimp, you see they differ predictably on the east and west side of the isthmus based on their pincher, which pincher is elaborated and larger in size. And so on the Atlantic side of the Isthmus of Panama, it is their right front pincher that is a much larger size, that is elaborated. On the Pacific side, it's their left pincher. There's no functional difference between the right and left pincher in terms of how it functions when it's got a greater size, when it's elaborated. As long as those shrimp have one pincher that's elaborated. It's used for sexual selection, for attracting mates. It's also used for defense against predation. So it doesn't matter whether you're right or left-handed, let's say. What matters is that one of your front pinchers is elaborated. And so it's just kind of a relic of natural selection that on the Pacific side, they're all left-handed. On the Atlantic side, they're all right-handed. So just a few finer details regarding evolution by natural selection, and then we'll end with some current perspectives on evolution. Natural selection selects at the individual level. So like that bird predation example, right? It's the individual peppered moth that's going to be selected either for or against. Evolution, however, is measured at the group level, at the population level, or at the species level. So natural selection operates on the phenotype at the individual level. Evolution is measured in the genotype or gene frequencies at the population level. This is just something important to file away in the back of your mind. We'll talk more about phenotype and genotype in Lecture 3. We operate under the assumption that organisms are maximizers. They're currency maximizers. And the currency that we use is fitness or genetic descendants. We're not really interested in necessarily how long they live if that length of life doesn't translate into reproduction. What we really want to do is essentially count babies, but it's not enough even to count babies. What we really want to do is count grandbabies, great-grandbabies, great-great-grandbabies, so on and so forth. So we are interested in the proportional representation in the genes of future generations. And so we operate as if maximizing reproductive output and surviving offspring is going to maximize our fitness. This may not be true. We'll talk about some interesting things that come to light as human populations experience what's called the demographic transition, a shift from high mortality, high fertility to low mortality, low fertility. We may, in fact, not be fitness maximizers at all. And so we'll come back to that as the term goes on. Also, natural selection is a creative process. It doesn't reinvent the wheel every time it needs a wheel. It doesn't reinvent the eye every time it needs an eye. So, for example, we've got some nocturnal primate populations, tarsiers, lorises, owl monkeys, etc. Our eyes are made up of photoreceptors that are either rods or cones. Generally, rods are associated with night vision, cones are associated with light vision and color vision and such. Primates evolved as diurnal species, and so they have an eye that is comprised of more cones than rods. Some taxa of primates, the lemurs and lorises, except the lemurs on Madagascar, and then some specific monkey species like owl monkeys secondarily became nocturnal. They didn't then fashion a new eye that had more rods than cones. They still have a diurnal eye. So natural selection was creative in how it enabled them to develop better sight at night. And what it did was selected for really, really large eyes, for big orbits and big eyes filling those, so that you're able to increase the number of rods, not by changing the proportion of rods to cones, but simply making the eye bigger. Therefore, that bigger eye has more rods. And so these animals often look like bug-eyed animals. Their eyes are really large. They almost bug out of their heads. They're kind of like Littlest Pet Shops, or those particular beanie stuffed animals that have really big eyes that preteen girls seem to be uniquely attracted to. My daughter went through a big-eyed animal phase, and even now, she sees an animal with big eyes. She's like, "Oh, it's so cute." So it represents this creative way that natural selection may innovate new traits. I like to compare natural selection to like recycled garbage art, right? That it takes something that exists and puts it together in new and unique ways to come up with something that's beautiful and functional, etc. We can make art out of garbage. We can make nocturnal eyes out of diurnal eyes. So we'll end with some current beliefs on evolution. This was a survey that was done by the journal Science in 2006 for the first time, and then again in 2014. And it asked people, which of the following statements comes closest to your views on the origin and development of human beings? So please note, it's not asking about phyletic evolution. It's not asking about changing gene frequencies through time, which is the best kind of simple definition of evolution. It's not asking about descent with modification. It is asking a loaded question. It is specifically asking about speciation events that led to the emergence of anatomically modern humans. So those three statements are humans evolved with God guiding, or human beings have developed over millions of years from less advanced forms of life, but God guided the process. This is the equivalent of modern day intelligent design, that we have an intelligent designer who somehow shapes the path that evolution takes. The second statement is that human beings developed over millions of years from less advanced forms of life, but God had no part in the process. This is associated with atheism. This is really just straight evolutionary theory. And the third statement is that God created human beings pretty much in their present form at one time or another within the last 10,000 years or so. This is what we call young Earth creationism. The idea that the Earth is only about 10,000 years old, that fossils exist because those animals didn't make it on the ark when God flooded the Earth. This is gaining traction, kind of scarily, gaining traction politically, in that Sarah Palin several years ago was an advocate of young Earth creationism. Mike Pence is an advocate of young Earth creationism. Young Earth creationists are informing scientific curriculum in states like Texas. This is something you should probably be worried about. There's an organization called Answers in Genesis that was founded by Ken Ham and still has Ken Ham on its board of directors. Ken Ham has built the Creation Museum in Kentucky, where you can go into Eden and use an authentic dinosaur saddle to ride on the back of the Triceratops like Adam would have done. Ken Ham has also built an Ark experience also in Kentucky, and then complained that atheists and the negative attention of atheists are drawing too much of his business away and making it an economic failure. So these are very vocal lobbyists, very vocal people influencing public policy. With this belief that the Earth is less than 10,000 years old, and the age of the Earth can be determined by the number of begats in Exodus. So what we found from 1982 to 2014 is that about the same proportion of people believe in young Earth creationism now as did then. It was 44% in 1982. It's 42% in 2014. That's not statistically different. We have seen that the number of people, quote-unquote, believing in intelligent design has gone down to 34% from 38%. We have seen an increase in the proportion of the population that believes in evolution, from 9% up to 19%. But this is worrisome. Evolutionary theory forms the very foundation of biology. It should be the first thing taught in biology, even before carbon and what's living and non-living. We should be teaching evolutionary theory because it is the backbone of biology. It's the backbone of medicine. It's the backbone of public health. It's the backbone of all of this. And it's not something that's not true simply because you decide not to believe in it. And so a lack of belief in evolution it correlates with a lack of belief in science in general. There's this principle in biology that the most parsimonious explanation is generally the most correct. And parsimony has to deal with the number of steps it takes to get to that solution. So simpler models are better than complex models. That explanations with fewer steps are better than explanations that have a very large number of steps. And there's nothing more parsimonious than attributing something to causally to God, because God said so. Humans exist because God said so. Airplanes fly because God said so. We won't die from polio because God said so. And so accepting that kind of explanation for evolution versus creationism leads you to also disbelieve in other forms of science. The religious right, for example, many evangelical Christians don't vaccinate because they believe that vaccines are harmful and that God gave us everything we need in our immune system to be able to fight off contagious diseases that pose a big public health hazard. So this disbelief in evolution is symptomatic of a general disbelief in science. What is perhaps even more worrisome is that we we rank second to last among developed nations across the world. So South America, Africa, Asia, Japan, China, Australia, Western Europe, we fare worse in our belief in science. The only nation that ranks lower on us, the lower than us, is Turkey, and Turkey has a theocracy in place right now. And so in the United States, it's associated with fundamentalist Protestantism, particularly evangelism. In Turkey, it's associated with fundamentalist Islam. So some of the contributing factors include a poor understanding of biology, particularly genetics. We just don't understand heritability and how heritability can lead to even morphological traits, much less behavioral traits. We have a politicization of science. We are becoming incredibly polarized with respect to politics, with respect to science. So you either believe in evolution, and you probably are leaning a little bit on the liberal end of the spectrum, or you believe in creationism, and you're the far right. You either believe in climate science and are classified as the far left, or you don't believe in climate science and are classified as the far right. Politics shouldn't meddle in science. We shouldn't have the oil and gas industry funding environmental research, particularly that which is designed to open up national parks and such to commercial interests. We shouldn't have cigarette or tobacco companies funding research on lung cancer and cigarettes. We shouldn't have pharmaceutical companies funding biomedical engineering and the development of new drugs. So, we've got money and politics kind of playing a role in science. And then we've got this literal interpretation of the Bible, that the idea that every story in the Bible is absolutely true, and is not the interpretation of men and religious dogma. And so John Miller of Michigan State University said American Protestantism is more fundamentalist than any, except perhaps Islamic fundamentalism. And it's religious fundamentalism that threatens science, because there's nothing more parsimonious than because God said so. So we'll end on a quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson. The good thing about science is that it's true whether you believe it or not. I may have offended you in this lecture talking about evolutionary theory and current perspectives on it. This class fulfills a science requirement for non-science majors. So we are treating evolution as fact. We are treating science as fact. We aren't going to entertain theological or philosophical discussions into other mechanisms. So evolutionary theory forms the very basis for everything we're going to talk about all semester. So you don't get to argue a creationist standpoint in this class. You need to open yourself to understanding evolutionary theory and how traits can emerge because of environmental selection pressures, and even human traits emerge because of environmental selection pressures. So if this greatly offends you, this might not be the right class for you to take. Anyway, we will move on now to lecture 3, talk about more about genetics and heritability, and address the idea of whether behavior can evolve.